Okay, Cesar Baldelomar. So you're a third year PhD student in theology and education at Boston College with a background in law, having earned a JD and an LLM. You recently wrote an article, an op-ed, on a very timely and interesting topic, hope. The piece included some very important points and ideas that I imagine many people can identify with in light of the global reality today. In your piece, you refer to the scary political realities that we're witnessing and that things over the past decade might have actually gotten worse. We hear a lot of preach about hope, that we should be hopeful and focus on the positive. But you ask a very valid question in your piece, and I quote, would it not be more honest to face life through a realistic or even a pessimistic lens, leaving hope aside, even if only briefly? You question what it means to teeter on the edge of non-existence, naming corruption and hypocrisy by financial and political elites. You question whether democracy has reached its breaking point. One of my favorite points in the piece is one that is often overlooked. And it relates to the ability of a certain group of individuals to afford to entertain the idea of hopelessness and harbor pessimism, while another group might be too busy trying to survive to even have the time to entertain such an idea. You say that honest hearts shouldn't fear confronting and embracing hopelessness, but it can be scary to do so and to admit that the words of hope and promise of justice by individuals and organizations are in fact hollow and meaningless. You suggest that perhaps the most effective form of resistance could include embracing hopelessness and adopting a pessimistic stance towards individuals and institutions. You finish strong by suggesting that perhaps true agency can only come about through asserting hopelessness for those who are suffering. And for the rest, you say that hope might need a sabbatical out of respect for the former group. These are very deep ideas that are definitely worth discussing further. In most circumstances, and especially in challenging times, the default advice you get from professionals as well as regular people in your life is usually to be hopeful, right? To look at the bright side, but you're suggesting the opposite. In your conclusion, we get a glimpse of your rationale, which relates to agency and respect. So let's start there. How do you think hopelessness, agency, and respect to those individuals who might be going through difficult times connect with each other?
Araz, first of all, thank you for holding this space, and for having this conversation with me. So I really appreciate you doing that in the first place. And secondly, this is an issue that I've been grappling with for quite some time, actually, since I was a teenager, I would say, right? Listening to the lyrics of my favorite rapper, Tupac, whom I mentioned in the piece. But I think hope is, first thing we need to do with hope is make sure we parse it. So what am I talking about when I mean hope? I don't mean your individual hope, my individual hope, right? The hope of everyday life. I don't mean that. I mean hope in the structures that are ruling the world right now, right? So whether they're religious structures, political structures, economic structures, even sports, which give people a hope, right? My team is going to win. I feel better, that type of stuff. That's what I'm talking about in terms of embracing hopelessness when it comes to those institutions. And so a related point is pessimism. It's a pessimistic stance toward these very same institutions. And that does include churches. It does include our government, right? It does include all this. What distinguishes us, though, from libertarianism, which is not a position I'm advocating, is that, yes, in our day-to-day life, there should be struggles for justice. But I am very suspicious when someone embodies that justice, right? When that one individual, that one person suddenly has 7 million, 8 million Instagram followers because they're talking about justice. That to me is where things start getting a little suspicious. And I think we should all adopt a pessimistic stance toward institutions or individuals who promise a better day, especially given that things have not changed much over the past 50, 60, some might even say millennia. Some might say things have gotten worse, right? So there's this notion of progress also at stake here that we have to interrogate. And notion of progress is, number one, essential to capitalism, because capitalism sees itself as a system that moves society forward, but it's also part of the liberal experimentation, right? The democratic liberal experiment, that things are getting better and that we can make changes through the system, through the vehicles like law, for example. I remember one of the reasons that I left law in a way, or the practice of law, is because I just, from seeing immigrants in court and seeing what they're subjected to, you can see that court is not going to be an effective way to handle political change or better people's lives. What law can do is provide a respite for a bit, right? It can provide injunctions, it can provide time to breathe. But as we see with grand law or meta law, especially Supreme Court decisions, we see that just as easily as rights are given, so they may be taken away based on political ideology by those sitting on the court. So to even stake hope in law and in legal progress is, I think, very dangerous, and something that especially communities on the margins, so I'm talking about the sexually marginalized, those marginalized because of gender, sexual orientation, race, class, those people cannot afford to depend on the legal system, on politicians, especially after Citizens United. I would say that was a disastrous decision for our political system. Once you name corporations as persons, and once those persons can make limitless contributions, we all know that they're going to be donating to those parties that are interested in bolstering the bottom line of these corporations, and that usually does not go well for the people, right? So it's just a struggle all around. And if you want to talk about the environment, that's a whole other point there. I mean, books and books have been written about environmental injustice starting in the 1960s. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was one of the first heralds to say, hey, the bees are dying. There's a reason behind this. We're poisoning our environment with DDT. We're killing people, especially the poor, with these pesticides. Then you have in 1982, Fritjof Capra, who's a physicist, wrote a book called The Turning Point. And in The Turning Point, he said, hey, things might be getting a little too late. The window might be closing in terms of making a change for the environment. And that was back in 1982, right? And he cited many of the same issues we have today: smog, pollution, garbage, you name it. All the issues that we're dealing with today, global climate change, migration because of global climate change and rising sea levels, all those things were mentioned by Capra in his book in 1982. And here we are in 2022 with looming global war, right? Who would say that war in Europe, in the 21st century, especially after the atrocities of the past century, almost 100 years, right? It's, to me, Foucault comes to mind, Michel Foucault, the famous French philosopher, when he said that history is just domination upon domination.
Are you in a way equating hopelessness to giving into the current system and the current structure? And if so, I mean, there's two arguments that can be had in this, right? There's the philosophical thought sort of process that we can go into about what does it mean to be hopeless in today's world? And as you asked, what does it mean to teeter on the edge of non-existence? And then there's the realistic way, which I think they can intertwine in a way when we talk about what's really going on in the world. And by being hopeless, we can gain back our agency in a way, right? How do you see that happening?
That's a very fascinating question, a very tough question to grapple with. So thank you for that. And it's definitely something I've thought about, right? This whole, are we giving into the system, or does the rhetoric itself suggest just don't do anything, right? Which we know, especially for those who are interested in the Bible or biblical texts, we know that in the book of Revelation, for example, lukewarmness, not doing anything, is equated with evil, actually, with bad, right? I'm here to say that I disagree. I think sometimes not doing something is actually the biggest form of agency one has, especially when they're cued. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you're Black and queer, right? You're expected now to speak on behalf of Black Lives Matter and queer rights, right? LGBTQI rights. And that script is part of this capitalistic wheel as well. It's expected of you to be a social justice warrior. And that has its repercussions. That can, hurt you in terms of finances. It can hurt you in terms of future possibilities for projects. And of course, there's that temptation that I need to be the prophetic voice for the future, right? Which again traps you into that mode, that character that really limits what you can do in other ways. And so that's why what I'm advocating here is not to stop talking about justice. I think Gen Z, for example, many of my students whom I teach are very much for justice, whether that's ecological justice, social justice, racial justice, economic justice. But again, what they're suspicious of are the people and the institutions that are preaching these things. So I think there's an end here that is justice and a more equitable society. The question is, can we envision going about that in ways that we have not yet done, right? And what I mean by that is avoiding the script of the social justice warrior, where you yourself become a trope. You yourself become limited to a particular vocabulary that ultimately you're trying to sway politicians. And is that ultimately what we want? Or do we want to take the conversation in a different direction and try to see what happens by, for example, self-stylization? If I stylize myself or dress or talk in ways that are not expected of me, how will that jolt an imagination of what people do expect of you, right? And I think that itself is a justice issue right there. Related to that is epistemic justice. It's how do we know what we know? Who produces knowledge? Who produces meaning? All these things are questions we should be asking. Do I think protests are valuable? Absolutely. But you know what's more powerful is leaving ideas behind for future generations to ponder and think how to move stuff in different directions, not just forward, in totally different, unforeseen directions. So I think epistemic justice, I think self-stylization, and I think working around the system while also working within it, but in other ways, creative ways. These are vital points of resistance that I think are underexplored, especially on the left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is really a lot to me. I think a lot of people have been thinking about these questions and these topics. And in my view, the world has become so convoluted in a way for us to even be able to navigate. And you said, just to challenge a little bit the idea of future generations pondering upon ideas that we leave behind. I struggle to understand how that might happen, because in the age of information, where there's more information than we ever dreamed about having access to today, we still see ourselves dealing with issues that we thought wouldn't exist if we had all these sort of privileges of having access to whatever we want. We deal with misinformation today. We deal with anything you can imagine, people trying to manipulate reality and push their agendas forward. So I think I tend to be a very hopeful person, and I definitely look at the positive side, but in this specific topic, I definitely feel a bit hopeless about how we might move forward. And I wonder whether more, kind of pushing more information into the system is the answer.
Yes, I'm torn with that because I don't think that just pushing more information will change things, right? I think all that will happen is you'll have a lot of information from which to choose from, which is itself a good thing, right? And again, we get into the contradictions because that kind of is capitalism. You're given a million options and you choose the one that's the most persuasive to you.
Yeah, in theory, it's a good thing, but
In theory,
in reality,
right?
we get into a lot of complications.
Absolutely. And as we know, capitalism is pushed politically, right? So it's like the product that you want to buy might not necessarily be the best product. It's just the one that's most heavily marketed and pushed for specific reasons by specific people, right? So there is no invisible hand, definitely rejecting all that theory of invisible hand and the market does what it does, moving toward progress. No, we need to reject that, I think, as a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
But in rejecting that, you're often asked, well, what's the alternative? Or at least I'm often asked, what's the alternative? And this is where I get into the most heavy debates. It's like, why do I need to have an alternative right now? I get that the window is closing, but I think we all have our individual talents and responsibilities. And it just depends where you find yourself. So again, I'm here to support whoever is protesting for justice. Hey, they have my support. Does that mean I'll go and march? No, my talent right now, or my responsibility, is the knowledge that I'm producing, the knowledge that I'm imparting to my students in the classroom. From there, other change might come. Tupac used to say famously during interviews, I might not be the one to change the world, but I for damn sure will be the spark that will lead to someone else changing the world or others changing the world, right? So it's about being that spark. And I see that as my vocation, my responsibility as an intellectual, as a scholar, without any fantasies of, marching in the street. Or now, have I done that before? Absolutely. I've marched for immigrant rights in Miami. I've marched for economic rights in a couple of cities around the US. So yes, I will protest. But ultimately, what I'm seeing is that even the protests themselves are just becoming entertainment value. They're not really pushing for change. They can't, because the way the system works is they'll give you the permit to protest, right? So you're already granted authority and permission. I seek more transgressive ways of getting at the heart of what is true resistance. So I'm looking for real transgression. Does that mean doing illegal things? I'm not going to comment on that. Does that mean being a trickster? Perhaps.
Yeah, looking for new ways is something that's been explored. And maybe, can you think of any examples where that's sort of succeeded, that type of thought process? Or has it also sort of been, sucked back into the world order that we know of?
Yeah, there's this book called Commodify Your Dissent that speaks to your point. It's like everything that becomes countercultural always gets subsumed back into the culture in some way, shape, or form. And on that related note, Marcella Altus Reed, she was a famous queer theologian. She died in 2009, I believe, but she has this famous quote where she says, poor are the groups or the people that move from the margins to the center because they lose their power. Right. And sometimes it's not the people this is not the people's decision to move from the margins to the center. Sometimes, again, the forces move them to the center. And I think this is one of capitalism's secrets to success. It allows all these views under the guise of democracy in order to maintain and keep the system going. Right. It's offering a marketplace of ideas. And as long as they're not destructive to itself, they'll open up those gaps and then have you live in that area, that margin, and then you join the center for a bit, and then you join the margin again. So it's like a dance back and forth, and the system unfortunately has that flexibility to allow that, and that's what keeps people, I think, trapped in this hope, that things could be different, because the system itself allows for the vision of hope to emerge from its sources, from its self-stylizations, from the people, from entertainment, from music, etc.
Yeah, let's talk about democracy a little bit, and capitalism, which again, they're related. Personally, I see capitalism as sort of the main thing that's driving everything that we know of, especially in this country and in the Western world in general. But there's also the idea of democracy, which, as you were saying, it's kind of malleable, it's flexible. You can bend it and make it act in different ways, and that's where you said, that helps the process of things getting sucked back into the system and just kind of becoming the new normal. And we think we're making change, but in reality, you look at history and you see a lot of the same loops happening over and over again, like Foucault says. Also, what do you think about that?
I think these are questions that we're all grappling with, honestly. I get this sentiment from my students. I get the sentiment whenever I'm at a cafe and overhear conversations. There is this nervousness. And at the same time, there's a terror at the realization that things might be a loop. They really might be, right? And I think we live in a generation when we think that we're all special. And don't get me wrong, we all, have the inherent possibility to create and to be ourselves, and that itself is special, right? But there's nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes lays that out pretty well. And by the way, Ecclesiastes is a text that is disregarded in Christian circles, at least. I don't know enough about the Jewish tradition, but in Christian circles, Ecclesiastes is not a text you're going to hear mentioned or preached about, because some people have charged that it is an inherently negative, nihilistic, pessimistic text. So there even is the possibility within the tradition of this nihilism, this pessimism, and we just haven't embraced it. Because again, we've fallen prey to Enlightenment notions of progress, to Enlightenment notions of hope in a better tomorrow, to Enlightenment hopes of we can do it ourselves, always, right? And now we see this with technology. Technology will solve all our problems. You have Elon Musk, right, flying to, space. It's like, well, we're not all going to go with him if the world decides to, we decide to enter into nuclear warfare, or environmental degradation speeds up more than the predictions have it. The world is going to be uninhabitable, I think, if we don't change course. And that's the problem. Again, 1982, physicists were saying, it's time. We're here in 2022, and much change has not happened, despite, Greta Thunberg's pleas, despite the pleas of justice. We're still stuck in a myopic kind of parochial way to protest. And that's not going to work in the 21st century. That is much more complex. So I think recordings like this, for example, right, social media, I think there is some possibility for resistance, even though, right, we all have to be careful with the temptation of becoming the next idol of social justice. So I think as long as one resists that temptation and uses these platforms to spark ideas, again, for me, I think it's about ideas. Walter Mignolo, the famous decolonial scholar, said that the most famous battles, or the most important battles of the 21st century, will be waged in the battlefield of ideas. And I think that that is crucial. I think it is about ideas, because we are at that turning point where we're transitioning from the modern social capitalistic world, right? The modern capitalistic world, to a post-capitalistic society. And I think we're seeing the fissures, the birth pangs of a new society. The point is how to embrace it and who's going to be at the fore. There needs to be conversations that go beyond capitalism at this point, though capitalism remains, I think, the main culprit, as you're saying. I think you're absolutely right. We see it in all aspects of life.
It could shift in form and become something a little bit different, but substantially, ideologically the same thing. That reminds me of I've been kind of skimming Nietzsche's Gay Science, where he does actually mention exactly what you were talking about here, that everything will come back to being the same thing, right? Maybe what he says in that book is the ultimate goal of our species is self-preservation, and no matter what happens, no matter what we think we're doing, that is where we're headed. And so you can think you're doing something that's a little different, but we are headed to a specific destiny, sort of. And I think I don't want to say that I definitely believe in that, because I tend not to go towards the route of destiny in my personal belief, but there's something to ponder there. And something also about nihilism, whether it has a place in that philosophy.
I think we are, I don't believe in destinies like you. I don't believe in destinies, in an astrological sense. But I do think that, so let's put that out there. Yes.
Yeah.
In terms of a destiny, something guiding, like a Sitkis, the spirit, right, floating through history, as Hegel would have it. No, I tend to favor more the Heraclitus, the world is flux type of, philosophy. That being said, I do think we're heading towards some type of collective catastrophe with the environment. So I do think there's a destiny that we have finally, and that destiny is destruction and death.
But it's a result of decisions that we made. It's not necessarily right.
It's not divinely ordained, by no means. It's not, inescapable. So might there be a little hope there? Am I saying that we might? Yes, if we get our act together now, and by we, I mean everyone has this collective responsibility. Now, some are more responsible than others. There is no doubt. I hate when people say the Anthropocene, as if blaming entire humanity for environmental degradation now. No, we know that it's the wealthiest countries in the world that have produced the most waste and destruction to the environment. So I think calling that out is the very first thing. That's the responsibility, first and foremost, falls to the most powerful countries. That's why I find the rhetoric very difficult to accept when they're talking about justice in the US, right? The US cannot speak of justice. It's like the Catholic Church speaking about sexual ethics in light of the sexual abuse scandals. It's just, it loses its power, right? It loses its authenticity coming from certain voices. That's why I think the leading voices will come from Africa, Asia, Latin America, leading the way forward, right? If there is any possibility. But this is where hopelessness and nihilism comes along. The quicker we get out of the way of the Western powers trying to fix themselves and let that collapse, the quicker other civilizations, other peoples can come and pick up those pieces and take it in directions completely unforeseen by the West. So that's what I mean by embracing hopelessness. It's embracing hopelessness to watch these structures crumble, to see what will emerge from people traditionally not allowed to speak or to think, right? Or to build even. So that's what I'm saying, and that's going to take a while. But in terms of nihilism, Wendell Phillips, who was the famous abolitionist in Massachusetts of the 19th century, he wrote here in a speech he gave to Harvard, he said, "Nihilism is the righteous and honorable resistance of a people crushed under an iron rule. Nihilism is actually evidence of life, the last weapon of victims choked beyond all other resistance. It has crushed humanity's only means of making the oppressor tremble. I honor nihilism since it redeems human nature from the suspicion of being utterly vile, made up of heartless oppressors and contented slaves. This is only an American view. The child of 1620 and 1776 can take of nihilism. Any other unsettles and perplexes the ethics of our civilization." So what he was arguing here is for perplexity, confusion, making sure that the masters can't use hope against the slaves. But it also brings up, again, to repeat Foucault, this whole domination upon domination. So say the world does become equitable and just filled. The question then turns to human nature. Will there be, somebody at the top? Of course there will be. Will there always be a ruling class? Absolutely. And that's the problem, right? To hope for an egalitarian, perfect society, given our human nature, given our desires, our impulses, given our state as animals, really, right? Yes, reason can come in and kind of do its thing, but given our impulses as animals, honestly, I don't think that that's ever going to be a possibility to have an egalitarian worldwide civilization.
That's a structural way, definitely, to think about it. And another way I've been kind of coming back to this the whole time we've been talking is what this whole thing means about the meaning of life. When we, the point that we've kind of mentioned but haven't really gotten deep into is, some population actually affording to think that hopelessness is the way to go and embracing it, why not? Because they're probably to an extent comfortable in their lives to be able to do that. I remember having a conversation with someone who has come from a refugee background and has had a very difficult life, talking to their son about a depression and feeling very nihilistic and feeling very hopeless, and saying, growing up, I didn't have time to think about all of these questions about whether life has a meaning and, if it's worth it for me to go to work every day or to wake up even every day. So there's this group of people who's busy trying to survive, trying to secure the basic needs of life, who can't really afford, like you say in your piece, to think about hopelessness and really embrace it in the scary way that some people might think it is.
Absolutely. And that's something I grapple with as well, right, in my thinking. And that's some pushback that I always get. So thank you for bringing that up. The pushback is, well, is this more of a middle upper class kind of luxury, right, to think about hopelessness? And another related pushback that I get is in the international context, right? It's like, especially if you're coming from like a war-torn country, or you're coming from a situation like my parents came from, which there was a revolution and they had to escape for fear of their life and left with nothing but really a backpack and a few documents. So when faced with those situations, I always take a step back and yes, and acknowledge that. I'm not here to dismiss people's feelings that it might be a better situation in one country than another. Not pushing back against that at all. But I guess what I'm trying to raise here is that yes, though you might not be facing actual physical violence, and let's be reminded here that yes, people do face physical violence in the United States, right? There are kids locked up as we speak in cages, 6, 7 year olds, 5 year olds, 4 year olds even, who are locked up like animals in cages, right? Obviously, we know about police brutality across the country. We know of incidences of rape in corporations, in schools, etc., right, against women and men. So it's to say that there is no physical violence is a lie, I think, and we're not being honest with ourselves. Now, of course, it's not at the scale of a revolution, for example, right? But what comes to mind here is that though things might not appear to be as bad, you have to look at the other contingencies. And what I mean by that is, Foucault wrote about this many times and he spoke about it also during interviews when he said, well, what do you prefer? To have your hand cut off for stealing something as they would do, or to have a paper trail following you for the rest of your life because you stole something and you're never going to be able to have an opportunity to, land a well-paying job or even apply for housing in certain places or even have a bank account, or even vote. So it's like all these things. So do you want the less violent route, which is we're just going to keep documents about you and who you are and then form an identity? Or do you just want your hand chopped off? So I think it's a matter of pick your poison, right? And hopelessness is kind of like pick your poison. Hopelessness can be both a elixir of life in some ways, and it can also be a poison, right? It's what the Greeks call the pharmakon. It can do both. It can give you life and it can kill, like anything else, I think. So when I talk about hopelessness, it's not to, reject people's experiences. Definitely, that's definitely when I'm about embracing people's experience, learning from each experience. But what I am saying is also be aware of the injustices occurring in the current context under the guise of it's much better or more civilized.
That's more along the lines of existentialism, which a lot of people think actually existentialist philosophy is sad and hopeless. But true existentialists and the philosophers themselves who wrote these ideas, they don't think about it like that at all. They actually think about it in a very hopeful way because it means that you can have an impact on how you go forward, not just yourself, but also a society. So there's hope in that sense, in embracing hopelessness, in seeing the world as it is, but also realizing that there is a way forward. And we need that, in psychology, you see that actually, like physiologically, we need a goal. We need to feel like we're working towards something. That's the only time we feel truly happy. And with that type of mentality, you can realize what's going on and really understand the realities of the sad realities sometimes of the world, but at the same time embrace it and work towards something, perhaps to mitigate the process a little bit, if not fix it. I don't want to sound like, oh, you can do it, you can change the system, because I don't believe that's easy.
Absolutely right. I think your reflection is spot on. I think both Camus, for example, Sartre, they knew about this radical freedom that we all have ultimately, right? If you let go of your shackles. But that's, I think, so much easier said than done, because
I think you have to sort of have that mindset, because I've had conversations with a lot of people from different backgrounds in my life, and I feel like some people just kind of, they have the ability to understand the reality while staying hopeful and seeing the glimpses of positiveness where they can contribute to, and that's great if you can. Sometimes you're in a position where you can't actually contribute, and that's very difficult, because even if you have the ability to see the positive, you can't contribute to it, and therefore you can't feed that physiological need to be happy and feel like you're working towards something. So it depends from person to person, of course, taking into consideration the backgrounds that people are coming from.
Yes, absolutely. And to go back to your question, because I think what you raised here is very much related to that. The question of who gets to be hopeless, basically, who can afford to be hopeless. And I think, well, yes, it definitely to philosophize itself about these things is a luxury, I think, and a privilege. But that doesn't mean that those teetering on the edge of extinction, for example, don't think about these things, right? They might not write about it or necessarily, read books, but they think definitely about existence and about even their non-existence in the face of this, right? Because how can people tell them they exist and that they're human beings when their treatment says otherwise? And I think the Afro pessimists point this out very well. But I think that everybody can afford to think about hopelessness because we already feel it. It's a matter of being, I think, honest with your feelings, right? And that's what you're talking about honest hearts at the beginning. And if I may, I want to read a poem here by Tupac quickly,
Mm-hmm.
which I think captures this, right? This was written by Tupac when he was 19 years old, 18, actually from 17 to 19 years old is when he wrote this. So think about a young Black teenager, right, writing these things, and here, by the way, is the handwriting. And it's called The Promise. Quote, I will give you liberty, but first give me your spirit. This I must confiscate before the evil fear it. I too would be afraid of passion governed by reason, an open mind to trying times when corruption is in season. The promise that they claim to be completely true is hypocrisy at its finest, a trick to silence you. Never will I believe a promise from the masters of the art. Trickery does not succeed with those with honest hearts. So what he's saying is, yes, these promises for a better tomorrow are different from an individual hope that you might have. They're tied, obviously, right? Political destinies are connected to personal destinies, because political decisions do affect us all, even to the most micro level, right? We can see how the war, for example, in Russia right now or the war in Ukraine, I'm sorry, is affecting gas prices here, something as small as that, right? So
Right.
it does have an effect. But what he's saying is, I'm not talking about your personal hope. I'm talking about this societal hope, these tricks that are being used to keep people truly complacent at the end. Because again, right, if you are promised the beautiful house with the white picket fence, et cetera, the white dog, the white car, all that stuff, then chances are you will domesticate yourself, right, and discipline yourself to reach those goals, right? So I think honestly, what's important to this conversation is what goals do we have, right? I think that's where it begins. It's like conversation on goals, honestly, and what success means, which again is tied to capitalism, tied to what people want and desire.